Alright folks, let's get going with today's Saturday session. As always, we're going to look to continue on, or for this little series of Saturday sessions that we've covered this semester, what we're going to continue on is our case studies from our Sovereignty and Partition section of our Leaving Cert History course. So fair play to everyone turning out today. Today's session is going to cover the impact of World War II on Northern Ireland. So we're going to look at it through the lens of the impact of World War II on the economy of Northern Ireland, which we're going to go a little bit past our case studies here. Our case study is obviously the Blitz. We're going to look at the Blitz in the context of Northern Ireland and how that impacted both the economy and I suppose the social impact or the social effects of our case study for this section of the course. So before we get going, I'd just like to highlight for anyone that's attending today's Saturday session, if you go onto ExamRevision's website and use the code HISTORY20, you'll get 20% off standard and premium plans on their website. Now that expires at 12 tomorrow night, 12 p.m. Sunday. So I'd recommend just going on using the code HISTORY20, 20% off both standard and premium plans. So that 20% would get you off, for example, if we look at our Leaving Cert History course here. So what ExamRevision offers is pre-recorded lessons or videos on every topic on the Leaving Cert History course. We've PowerPoints, H1 standard notes, and when I click in here, you'll see my favorite feature is the self-correcting quizzes. So if I go onto the Montgomery bus boycott here, you'll see I'll click on the video lesson. As I said, every topic from the Leaving Cert History course is covered in 10 to 15 minute video lessons of me going through all the most important parts of the topic. As I said, the most important or my favorite aspect of the website is those self-correcting quizzes there, where you can test your knowledge on each topic and it'll help you identify any gaps in your own knowledge. So that's what I'd use with my students all the time, really encouraging students to, engage in their own assessment of their learning, and that's the best way that you can study and I suppose progress for Leaving Cert History. So I'm just going to outline what we need to know for this section before we move on. So looking at our case study for our third case study from Partition and Sovereignty, which is the Belfast Blitz, we're going to look at the Belfast Blitz in the context of Northern Ireland. So firstly, we're going to outline the economic and social policies that were introduced in Northern Ireland from 1921 to 1939, so from the formation of the state with the Government of Ireland Act right up to the start of World War II. What social and economic policies were introduced in the country? How did that impact life for the people who lived there? Next, we'll outline the economic and social impacts of World War II, how that affected both the economy and the people of Northern Ireland, and then we're going to look at the Belfast Blitz, which is our case study here. And we're going to look at that within the context of, I suppose, the general theme of economic and social policies in Northern Ireland. And what we're really looking at here is the experience of life for people there. Before moving on, let's just outline where this comes up or where we will be using this in an exam situation. So if we have a look at our questions here, my pen never works when I'm live on YouTube here. So if you just follow my cursor here and we can read the questions together. So what was the impact on Northern Ireland of the world economic crisis, of the interwar period and or World War II? So I always like to highlight to my students a question that has and or is a really nice question to ask or to answer, because you have so much to talk about. You have two different periods to talk about here. The economic crisis, so the Great Depression, you're really looking at that interwar period, social and economic policies. If you've tuned into any of my Saturday sessions before, you know I'm a big advocate of answering economic and social policy questions. Although students might find them boring, I find them relatively, they're black and white in terms of history. It's very easy to talk about in economic and social policy, and it's really easy to analyze an economic and social policy because you just come back to whether it was successful or not, and there's stats and figures to back that up. Whereas if you're trying to interpret a different aspect of history, it can be harder to interpret the effect of propaganda because it's kind of an abstract concept, whereas economic and social policies are black and white. This is a really nice question because you're dealing with a huge period of history. You're essentially dealing with 1921 all the way up to 1945. So we're dealing with Northern Ireland for our whole, section of the book here that we're dealing with. So a nice question. Other questions that come up in the past around this that we'll use our case study for How did the government of Northern Ireland deal with economic problems and or threats to security? Those threats to security being World War II and the Blitz. So although it's not directly referencing the question there, that's what threats to security is referencing. If we go to our third question, what was the impact on Northern Ireland of international developments during the period 32 to 45? So that's essentially the same question. We have the economic crisis. Northern Ireland starts to feel the effects of the Great Depression around 32 all the way up to 45. So once again, question there a little bit more sneakily asked. International developments, or what's it talking about there? It's not as, I suppose, out there and in your face as the first question where it says talk about the economic crisis or World War II. This is the exact same question, just being asked in a different way. And we can see what were the main social and economic challenges facing Northern Ireland 1920 to 1945. So as you can see here, or hopefully what you can see from our past questions here, the Belfast Blitz isn't asked directly as a standalone question. It's asked within the context of economic and social challenges facing Northern Ireland. So that's how we're going to study this topic here in today's Saturday session. Before we look at that topic, as I said, I suppose the title of this session is Using Our Case Studies. We're getting to that time of the year now where, especially if you're in 6th year, guys, this is where I suppose all the fine tuning starts to begin. So what we're going to look at today is how we use our case study here to answer an exam question. So before we dive into how do we exactly use that, let's look at what the marking scheme is actually asking of us as Leaving Cert History students. So essentially, when you write a Leaving Cert History essay, you're going to be marked on two different, I suppose, sets of criteria. You have your CM, which is your cumulative mark. So you'll be marked for your historical content. Is it accurate and relevant to the question? Or your OE, your overall evaluation. So you're going to be marked for the overall quality of your answer within the context of the set question. So have you answered the set question that's been asked? Now I'm going to break these down in huge amount of details for you. And what's really important is you understand how you can use an understanding of these different criteria to essentially judge or to essentially dictate how you're going to write Leaving Cert History essays. So if we look at our cumulative mark, so our cumulative mark is marked on a sliding scale. So this is a direct quote from our marking scheme. I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. I'm going to break it down a little bit more student-friendly language here. But every paragraph that you write on your Leaving Cert History exam is marked out of 0 to 12 marks, 12 being the highest, obviously. So that's our sliding scale there. I'm going to break this down in student-friendly language on the next slide here, but I just want to highlight one word before we move on. Analysis. There's going to be a common theme here as we progress throughout this webinar today. I just want to highlight that word. I'm going to come back to it at a later point, so keep that at the forefront of your mind there. We're going to come back to the idea of providing analysis in Leaving Cert History. But our cumulative mark sliding scale looks like this. So you have your descriptors down the left-hand column here, poor to excellent. So an excellent paragraph would be achieving marks 11 to 12. And the characteristics of an excellent paragraph looks like this. An outstanding piece of analysis, exposition, or commentary, clearly expressed, accurate, and substantial information. So I'll let you digest the characteristics of that paragraph right now. Just maybe think to yourself, does that sound difficult to do? Outstanding piece of analysis. I'm going to come back to that now in 1 second. A very good paragraph, 8 to 10. Very good information, accurately and clearly expressed. Now what I'll just highlight to you guys is the difference in characteristics between a very good paragraph and an excellent paragraph. Outstanding piece of analysis. Keep that phrase in your mind. We're going to come back to it. But I suppose just a little insight into what we're going to cover. That's extremely difficult to do. Outstanding piece of analysis. A good paragraph, 6 to 7 marks. Worthwhile information, reasonably well expressed. That seems manageable. Worthwhile information. I think I can do that. Fair, 3 to 5. Limited information, barely stated. Poor, 0 to 2. Trivial or grave errors. Okay, our excellent paragraph. Let's have a look at this. Outstanding piece of analysis. That's extremely hard to do, and I often say to my students, I think in the time sensitive situation that you guys are in your Leaving Cert History exam, like I'd struggle to write an outstanding piece of analysis for every single paragraph, 10 paragraphs across 3 essays in the space of 2 hours and 50 minutes. That's extremely difficult to do. So I always like to highlight to my students here to let's manage our expectations around we're not really going to achieve an excellent paragraph for every single paragraph in our essays. So it's extremely rare to be awarded 11 to 12 marks on a paragraph. What I like to say to my students is you'd almost have to portray the historical event in a new light for the examiner. And think about how experienced our Leaving Cert History examiners are. It's very difficult to portray an event in a new light for that examiner. So let's manage our expectations around achieving 11 to 12. It's extremely rare to be awarded 11 to 12 on a paragraph, let alone 11 to 12 for 6 paragraphs across an essay. I'd say what we call a black swan event. Let's look at our fair to good range. So these are the most common paragraphs that are awarded. So we have 3 to 7 marks, good and fair. This is going to tell us how many paragraphs we need to write in our essays to maximize the amount of marks we receive. So if we manage our expectations around, okay, I'm going to receive anywhere between 3 to 7 marks for my paragraphs in my Leaving Cert History essay. If we look at the characteristics of that, worthwhile information, reasonably well expressed, limited information, barely stated, I think I can achieve that across 10 paragraphs in a Leaving Cert History essay, even in that time pressurized environment. Let's keep that good and fair, that 3 to 7 mark range in our head, because we're going to use this information from the marking scheme to tell us how many paragraphs we need to write in our Leaving Cert History essays to maximize the amount of marks that we can receive. And it's extremely important to have an okay understanding of that, because it's going to dictate how much we need to write. So this is all very important information for you guys, the student, because it tells you how much you need to write in every paragraph and in every essay. Before we look at what I call the sweet spot of essays, let's look at our overall evaluation, because our cumulative mark is marked out of 12. It's 60 out of your 100 marks for your essay. Now we have our OE, which is 40 marks out of your 100 for the essay. So when awarding the OE, examiners are evaluating the quality of your answer by taking the following into account. Now think about that word that I put a red box around earlier. That's going to pop up again. So firstly, to what extent has the student showed the ability to analyze the issues involved in the question? E.g., is it more than narrative? Secondly, to what extent has the student used relevant evidence to support their analysis? Then finally, third, to what extent has the candidate shown the ability to argue a case and to reach conclusions? We see that word analysis, analyze, come up again. That's 3 times in 2 pages of our Leaving Cert History marking scheme. We see the word analyze. What you guys need to take away from that is that it's not good enough to tell the story in Leaving Cert History. We're not here to tell the story of history. We're not here to provide narrative on the story of history. We need to analyze historical events by answering the set question that's been asked. And if you can take one thing away from today's essay, well, I'd actually ask you to take 2 things away. That you write 10 paragraphs in your Leaving Cert History essay. I'm going to explain that in 1 second. But students need to move away from that mindset of, oh, I need to just tell the story of history. I need to tell the facts, tell the story. History is not about telling the story. It's about providing analysis. And I'm going to give you strategies on how we actually do that within each specific paragraph we write at Leaving Cert History. So I know that can be so hard to do. Oh, what do you mean provide analysis? I'm going to give you strategies to provide analysis and to analyze historical events. But you need to have that understanding that it goes beyond telling the story of history. You need to provide analysis on history. You need to analyze historical events. So our OE marking scale, or our sliding scale, looks like this. So it's marked anywhere between 0 to 40, and it's marked on a sliding scale like so. As I said, this is a direct snippet from the marking scheme. I'm going to break this down into student-friendly language. Before we move on, let me highlight one thing to you. We see the word analysis come up again. And if we look at our sliding scale, okay, the different, I suppose, steps on our scale, if we look at where the analysis word comes in, it's at the H1 scale. Excellent. So if you are looking to achieve a H1 in Leaving Cert History, which is an achievable mark in Leaving Cert History, you need to be providing analysis. If you're not analysing historical events, you're not at a H1 standard, and that's what the biggest thing we need to take away from this. Second thing I'll highlight to you guys is this word wide reading. So shows detailed learning, wide reading. So we need to show the examiner, look, what I say is wide reading, viewing or listening. Books, documentaries, podcasts. That's all relevant information here. Doesn't have to be reading, but we need to be engaging with the content outside of the course. And that's so important. We show examiner that by providing little snippets of information that's not in the history book, by using quotes from different historians, different key personalities from that time. I'll show you that when we get down to our case study, how I use a quote from the Northern Irish Prime Minister during World War II to show, look what I'm doing. I'm going outside of, I suppose, my required reading for the course. I'm going and I'm engaging in that course content outside of that. We'll come back to that at a later stage. Okay, let's look at our overall evaluation. Now I'm going to fly through this, okay? So excellent, 34 to 40 marks. Excellent in its treatment of the set question, particularly if it shows detailed learning, wide reading or extensive coverage. We're going to use the words from the marking scheme here to our advantage, and we're going to use that as a strategy because the marking scheme tells you what you need to do. So if you want a H1, this is what you need to do. So we need to show evidence of wide reading. That's going to dictate how we write our paragraphs at Leaving Cert History. Okay, very good. 28 to 33. Very good, but not excellent in its treatment of the set question. Accurate and substantial history. 22 to 27. Good standard of treatment of the set question without being exceptional in the information or commentary supplied. Now I'm not going to read through the fair to very weak characteristics there, but if you can notice one theme that's coming up, if you're not even aiming for a H1 in history, but you want to be up towards the higher end of the marks, notice what the OE is asking you to do. Good standard of treatment of the set question. Excellent in its treatment of the set question. It's asking you to answer the question that is being asked. So we don't just learn essays and regurgitate them on the day for Leaving Cert History. We carefully analyse what's that question actually asking me to do, and we need to address the set question in every single paragraph. Once again, I'm going to show you a strategy on how we do that, so just keep that in mind. You need to answer the set question that's been asked. Now I'm showing loads of information of you here. Last thing we're going to look at from the marking scheme is what a paragraph could be. So once again, very text heavy here. This is what a paragraph could be. It's for the examiner's sake on how they actually mark your paragraphs in a Leaving Cert History essay. Let's look at it in a little bit more student friendly language. We're going to focus on 3 types of paragraphs that we're going to write in our Leaving Cert History essays. First one, an introduction. So an introduction could give background information or historiography. It could define key terms, or it could explain the essay's approach. Now I always ask my students just to explain the essay's approach. So we say, firstly, this essay is going to look at the interwar economic crisis in Northern Ireland through the lens of agriculture and industry. Secondly, this essay will examine the social policies that were introduced during the interwar period in Northern Ireland and how that affected the experience of life for people. Thirdly, this essay, we never say the word I, this essay will discuss both the social and economic impacts of World War II on the Northern Ireland people and economy. So we just outline what the essay is going to do. That's so important to understand. It makes our life a little bit easier because we all know, we all have that feeling. Just getting started sometimes is the hardest part of the essay. So I just always say, just explain what you're going to do, explain what this essay is going to do, explain the approach. That's the phrase from the marking scheme. You're not going to pick up an excellent paragraph here. You'll probably pick up 4 or 5 marks at most, if I'm honest. But we just get that done, we just bite the bullet and get going on our essay. Second one, most important, and this is so important for you guys to understand. A paragraph could be an episode, phase, or stage in a sequence of events. So if we were looking at characteristics of life in fascist Italy, for an example here, just from my experience, I'll often see students talk about the March on Rome and the 1924 general election in the same paragraph. But they're 2 different episodes or phases in that sequence of events. So we deal with one phase in a sequence of events per paragraph. You focus on one historical event per paragraph. Don't mix 2 together. So you just focus on one Don't get overwhelmed. Focus on one historical event. Think about analysing that historical event and move on to the next one or the next paragraph. That's important to understand. I'm going to show you strategies on how we write and plan our paragraphs now in about 2 minutes, guys. I'm going to skip through the next ones because they obviously are relevant, but not what I get my students to focus on. And our last one then is a good concluding paragraph, which is not mere repetition. I'll go through, I suppose, how I write an intro paragraph towards the later end of this essay. But what I say to my students, don't get bogged down by the intro, just conclude, just summarize what you've done. It says not, which is not mere repetition, but I'll give you one little tip on how you can not repeat yourself in your concluding paragraphs. Okay, so we kind of broken down the marking scheme now. What that marking scheme tells you as a Leaving Cert History student is how much you need to write and what type of things you need to be writing about. I hope you guys can see that now. And I'm going to summarize all that into what I call the sweet spot. So the 10 paragraph essay. If you can take one thing away from today, you need to take away that you need to write 10 paragraphs in your Leaving Cert History essay. Paragraphs about half a page, just less than half of a page. That's going to work out that your Leaving Cert History essays are about 5.5 to 6 pages long. They don't need to be longer if you're writing 10 paragraph essays. So paragraphs just less than half a page. You need to write 10 of them, including your intro and conclusion. That's going to be around 5.5 to 6 pages long. That tells you how long you need to write. Let me show you the maths on how I get to this point, okay? So each essay that you write on your Leaving Cert History paper is marked out of 100 marks. Your CM, your cumulative marks, so what you get your marks for your historical content, it counts for 60 of those marks. Remember, that's marked on a sliding scale. Each paragraph is marked from 0 to 12. Your OE accounts for 40 marks. That's that snapshot view that the examiner makes. How you answered, I suppose, the general context of the question, how you answered the set question that's been asked. That's just a snap decision made at the end of it. So we write 10 paragraph essays, the sweet spot, because every paragraph is marked out of 12 marks. However, the majority of students only receive 4 to 7 marks per paragraph. Remember I said nobody's really achieving an excellent paragraph 12 out of 12. That's very, very rare. A black swan event, we call it. So we're going to write 10 paragraphs, including an introduction and a conclusion. Because if you divide 60 by 10, your cumulative mark by 10, that means we only have to pick up 6 marks per paragraph within that range. So if we write 10 paragraphs and pick up on average 6 marks per paragraph, some paragraphs you might get 4 or 5, some you might get 7 or 8, that's fine. But if we average 6 marks per paragraph, we've got 100%, we've got 60 marks out of 60 marks for our CM. And that gives us a great chance of our OE being up towards that end as well. So we cannot underestimate the importance of writing a 10 paragraph essay, because then you only need to average 6 marks per paragraph, resulting in you getting 100% here. And I'll often see my students actually scoring, maybe 70 out of 60 on their CM. They still obviously only get 60 marks, but that means they've got their full 60 marks for their CM. And then their OE is going to be around 30 to 40, depending on the quality of that essay. But that gives them a great chance to be up towards a high H2 or just at that low H1 range. And it's extremely achievable for all students. So biggest takeaway from today, 10 paragraphs in your Leaving Cert History essay. Okay, let's get into the context of how we're going to use this information. So what does good historical paragraphs look like? So I say that good historical paragraphs include 6 different things. So this is how we boost our CM and our OE. This is how we provide analysis. This is how we don't just tell the story of history, we analyze those historical events. So we need to do 6 things in every paragraph. You need to react to the question. So you need to read the question that's been asked, and you need to recycle keywords from that question in the first line of every paragraph. Then you state the main point of your paragraph. So if we were looking at the interwar economic crisis of agriculture in in Northern Ireland, and we could discuss how, or our argument was going to be that the impact of the economic crisis was, I suppose, felt extremely badly by the people of Northern Ireland. So we need to state that main argument. That's important to understand. Next, we need to provide factual evidence. I don't like the word facts or evidence. We need to provide 6 to 8 historically correct references. I don't want you guys getting into the mindset, oh yeah, I just need to provide facts, because then you just tell the story of history. We need historically correct references. That's a phrase I like more. We could have 3 historically correct references in one sentence. So it's not just a list of facts. Don't get into that mindset. We need to pick 1 or 2 of those historically correct references, and we need to explain that evidence. So we need to use phrases like consequently, this means that, therefore, thus, we can therefore see. We need to explain 2 pieces of evidence. I'm going to give you phrases to help you start explaining the evidence that you provide. 5, you need to show evidence of outside reading, watching, or listening. So think about our marking scheme there. If you want to score your H1 standard and your OE, the phrase within that says evidence of wide reading. How are you going to show the examiner that you've been engaging with reading outside the history course? It doesn't have to be reading, watching, listening, books, documentaries, podcasts. Last thing you need to do, one thing, biggest thing I could say to students that they always forget to do is link your argument back to the question. At the end of every paragraph, you need to use the keyword from the question in that paragraph. So we can say phrases like, we can therefore see that the agricultural crisis of the interwar period in Northern Ireland had huge economic consequences for the people of Northern Ireland. We just repeat that keyword from the question in the last sentence. We're showing the examiner, look, I'm answering the set question that's been asked. Let's have a look at a paragraph that I'd consider, probably it's definitely a H1 standard. It's probably a little bit above that, but you'll see the characteristics of you'll see the characteristics of good historical writing within this. So this paragraph, if I'm honest, is probably a bit long, but it has all the characteristics of good historical writing. So this is probably just over half a page here. So if we read through it together, historians have argued that Vladimir Lenin's economic policies had profound impacts on the economic landscape of Russia in the early 1920s. First thing that he does, reacts to the question. War communism was introduced by Lenin with the overriding aim of winning the ongoing civil war taking place between the Red Army and the White Revolutionists. Although the passing of all large factories into the hands of the government was successful in mobilizing production towards the war effort, upon reflection it had detrimental effects on the economy of the country. There he's stating his main argument. It had detrimental effects on the economy of the country. Next, they need to provide factual evidence. I won't read through all that, but you can see that there's huge historically correct references here. We can see percentages, we can see years, we can see agricultural production fell from 80 million tonnes in 1913 to 38 million tonnes in 1931. There's historically correct references throughout this paragraph. It's an excellent standard paragraph. What you'll also next is that evidence is explained. That this process is referred to hyperinflation. So he's explaining what that process is. That's an excellent example of good historical writing. We can also see that there is evidence of outside reading, viewing, or listening. And let's just focus in on this last question, or this last sentence here. We can therefore see that although Lenin's economic policy of war communism contributed to a Red Army victory in the Civil War, it had damaging effects on the economy of Russia and resulted in extensive change on future economic policies. So the question asked the impacts of Lenin's economic policies. The impact was it resulted in change. What else we can highlight? That there's linking words throughout the paragraph. Although, firstly, additionally, furthermore, secondly, consequently, as a result of, we can therefore see. These are called connective words. These phrases help boost your OE. So using phrases like firstly, secondly, thirdly, consequently, finally, therefore, are really going to boost your OE mark. But how do we actually use those phrases now? I'm just throwing loads of phrases at you and being like, oh, just start using these. No, we have strategies to help push these up as well. So in order to make sure that we're including the characteristics of good historical writing in our paragraphs, we're going to follow a Peel paragraph approach. So Peel stands for you make a point, you provide evidence, you explain 1 or 2 pieces of evidence, and you link your evidence back to the question that's being asked. So in order to help you structure your paragraphs, I recommend using the following phrases. So if you're trying to make a point, you can use phrases like, it can be argued that, historians have argued, the sources suggest, we can infer from the sources or the evidence. Now, if you're looking to provide evidence or historically correct references, or you're trying to use linking words in your paragraph, there's two types of linking words that we can use. If you're looking for words to help join ideas, you can say firstly, secondly, in addition, furthermore, moreover. However, if you're looking to change ideas, you can use phrases like however, conversely, on the other hand, alternatively, but. If you're looking to explain one or two pieces of evidence, this means that, therefore, consequently, as a result of, because of this. And if you're looking to use that linking sentence at the end of your paragraph, we can therefore see from the sources it is clear that. The most important factor from this is, in conclusion, we can see that. So what I recommend is all my students have this printed out and glued into the front of their essay copies. I literally just let them use these phrases as they write essays. So I'd recommend giving it a go and just using these phrases as you write your paragraphs is really going to help boost your CM, your ability to pick up CM marks, and your ability to pick up OE marks as well. So this is an integral part of my students' ability to write essays. Print it off, it'll be sent out to anyone that's attended today's webinar, and glue it into your copy and give it a go using these phrases to help structure your paragraphs. So what we've covered there in essentially is how you structure essays, or what we've covered there is how we structure paragraphs. You're looking to do 4 things: make a point, provide evidence, explain that evidence, and link it back to the question. And if you're doing those 4 things, you're on the way to boosting or maximizing your marks, as we say. Sorry, before moving on here now, what we need to look at is how we plan Leaving Cert History essays. So when I plan Leaving Cert History essays, I'm looking at it from 2 different levels or 2 different viewpoints. Firstly, macro or big picture planning. So we need to look at, I suppose, what is the paragraph topic or title we're going to write for our 10 paragraphs. And then we need to look at micro or fine details planning. So what are the smaller details that are going into each paragraph that are going to boost my CM? So let's have a look at our content for today. So I know I covered that. Probably took a little bit too long to cover all that, guys. But that's so important. I can't underestimate how important it is that you have a good understanding of that. Okay, so let's have a look at our essay question here. So what was the impact on Northern Ireland of the world economic crisis of the interwar period and or World War II? So this question came up in 2019. We've seen from our links to an exam situation, it's came up 6 times over the past 10 years. So quite relevant question. Okay, so we know from our sweet spot of paragraphs, or our sweet spot of Leaving Cert History essays, we need to write a 10 paragraph essay. So firstly, we need to write a conclusion. Secondly, our first paragraph, paragraph 1, is going to be on the interwar period and economic crisis, and we're going to focus on how that economic crisis affected agriculture. Paragraph 2, the interwar period again, economic crisis, we're going to focus on how it impacted industry. Paragraph 3, interwar period, social policies. Paragraph 4, social effects of World War II. Paragraph 5, economic effects of World War II. And then we're going to use our case study here. We're going to look at how our case study, which is the Blitz, affected both economics and social, or had economic and social effects on Northern Ireland. So we look at the Blitz. Now remember, hopefully what you'll see in here, I'm not just writing a paragraph on the Blitz, because the Blitz can be broken up into 3 separate phases in a sequence of events. So I deal with each phase in that sequence of events in its own paragraph. I cannot overstate how important it is to understand that. You don't just write a paragraph on the Blitz. We look at the 3 different bombings that took place there on the 7th or 8th of April, 15th to the 16th, and then the 5th of May. So we look at those 3 phases in the sequence of events in separate paragraphs, and we deal with them by themselves. I can't overstate the importance of that. And then finally we write our conclusion. So that's our macro, our big picture planning. So like what I stress to my students is when they're going into their Leaving Cert History exam, this is what they just need in their head. You're not going to be able to like have full essays regurgitated. If you can remember your macro plan from an essay, you're on the right track to doing well. You can remember that, okay, these are my 8 paragraph titles outside of my intro and conclusion, which makes it a 10 paragraph essay. Okay, let's look at our micro Plaid here, okay? So the fine details of this, and I'm going to cover the content as I go through this. And this will be sent out to anyone that, I suppose, completes the evaluation form at the end of today's Saturday session. So I'd recommend just getting that done if you'd like the notes. Okay, so our introduction, okay? So for our introduction, there's 3 different things we can do. We can write a historiography or provide background information, or we can just explain our essay's approach. I always recommend explaining our essay's approach, but for today, I'm going to cover the historiography just to give you the details that you need. So if we look at the background information of this essay title, so we'd start with obviously the Government of Ireland Act, how this partitioned the island of Ireland into 2 self-governing bodies. Obviously, we have Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State at that time. We can see that Carson achieved the Government of Ireland Act, but he refused to take the position as PM, Prime Minister. Sir James Craig takes that position instead. We could also discuss how the birth of Northern Ireland was marked by violence in the 1920s. We start to see divisions between Northern Ireland Unionists and Nationalists. We also see increased sectarian violence, as I suppose anxious Unionists, they've had that kind of siege mentality on the island of Ireland, revived the UVF at this point. We also we could highlight that the first elections in the Belfast Parliament show 90% turnout, and Unionists win a decisive victory. They held 40 seats. And we could also talk about the introduction of the Special Powers Act in 1922 led to increased sectarian discrimination. And you could look to back that up with facts or statistics there. There was 600 deaths over that 2-year period that marked the birth of Northern Ireland. Or you could explain the essay's approach. You're going to outline the economic crisis of the interwar period and outline Northern Ireland's involvement in World War II through, I suppose, how it acted as that industrial or it acted as an industrial support for the British wartime economy, and then how it was kind of brought into the war and was targeted by the Luftwaffe through the Belfast Blitz. But paragraph 1, we deal with the interwar economic crisis and we focus on agriculture. So the first thing you'd have to do there is outline the agricultural economy in Northern Ireland during the 1920s. And how you could discuss how agriculture was a vital component of that functioning economy. So over 25% of the population was employed in agriculture. That equates to 150,000 people, and it contributed £11 million a year to the Northern Ireland economy. So that actually was more than shipbuilding at this point. And it's often just, Belfast is often just thought about as this kind of shipbuilding powerhouse, and it was the most important industry in the economy. Agriculture contributed more than shipbuilding at this point. That would change. We also see small unproductive farms, very much like we'd see in the South or in the Irish Free State at this time. And we see similar to this, I suppose, the South's agricultural policies brought in the Land Act 1925. Landlords had to sell their land to farmers. They wanted to switch from, I suppose, small, unproductive family-run farms to large, commercialised, productive farming. We could also look at the impact of the economic crisis here on the agricultural economy. So Basil Brooks, who was Minister for Agriculture in 1933, looks to improve the standards of production in agriculture. So we've seen all this in the South as well when we looked at social and economic policies of Cumann na Gael and Fianna Fáil. We see the same type of policies. We want to see the improvement of standards of production. So the production of goods wants to be improved, both the quality and essentially how the product looks. And it looked to capitalise on the economic war between the Irish Free State and Britain during this time. We see the introduction of new farming methods that look to support farmers. Farmers got more access to loans, more access to capital to improve both the methods and the technology that they used on the farms. And it did benefit from the Free State's economic war with Britain. So we could back that up with statistics to show that the pig or pork exports rose from 200,000 in 1932 when the economic war between the Irish Free State and Britain started to 844,000 in 1939. I suppose we look at just right before the outbreak of World War II, when obviously agricultural demand would change at that point. Paragraph 2, we deal with the economic crisis and how that affected industry in Northern Ireland. First thing that we need to do is outline what the industrial economy looked like in the 1920s during Northern Ireland. What I should say to you guys here is you would not be expected to produce all of this in each paragraph. I'm covering the content through the lens of the paragraph that you would write. So you could just focus on one or two aspects from all this content here and write that in your paragraphs using your peeled paragraph approach. You're going to get up to your half a page is what you need. So what we could talk about industry in Northern Ireland, it was very unlike the Free State in this regard. So we see heavy industry, shipbuilding, linen production were the keys to Northern Ireland's industrial economy. So Northern Ireland experienced a boom period over the course of World War I, which continued up to the 1920s. However, post-war depression kicks in. Unemployment averages 23% over the 1920s, which is extremely high. After World War I, demand for army materials falls, like the likes of uniforms and parachutes that would have been produced in Northern Ireland's linen industries. And we see a woman-dominant linen industry hit the hardest. So exports fall. There was 74,000 employed in linen in Northern Ireland in 1924. 20,000 people lost their jobs by 1930 over a 6-year period. So that's a huge decrease and a huge increase of unemployment, especially for women in the Northern Ireland economy. However, we could also see shipbuilding growing 6% a year from 1900 up to World War I. However, obviously, World War I ends, the demands for ships fall, and now Northern Ireland has an excess of ships. So there's more ships that they can sell after World War I. And we can see the effects of that around, I suppose, the end of the Great Depression era here in the mid-1930s. Workman and Clark shipyard forced to close. Harland and Wolff, which we'll study when we go on to World War II economy, survives because the government provides subsidies to that private industry. And we see workers falling from 10,000 working in shipbuilding in 1930 to only 1,500 in 1932. So over a 2-year period, it's over 80% of its workers in that industry. So it shows you how hard that industry was hit over as soon as that Great Depression hits the world economy in 1929. The effects start to really be felt in not just Northern Ireland but Ireland as well around 1932 and 1933. Next, paragraph 3, we have our interwar period. So what social policies were introduced in Northern Ireland during that period? So we could look at the discrimination in workforces. So this, I suppose, we're going to see sectarianism come into play in Northern Ireland. So we talk about discrimination in jobs becomes an issue, especially as that economic crisis worsens. So like ads were put out looking for Protestant workers. That obviously increased tensions in Northern Ireland, and it also led to the development of the Ulster Protestant League in 1931, which looked to safeguard employment for Protestants. So we can clearly see a divide starting to begin in Northern Ireland between both identities or both groups of people, between unionists and nationalists, and that kind of bled into the workforce as well. So even think about that phrase, safeguarding employment for Protestants. It's very, very divisive in itself. So the Ulster Protestant League introduced a campaign to ensure that Protestant business only employ Protestant workers, and that was also reflected in the civil service. And we could also see Craig and Dawson Bates, who was the Prime Minister at the time. Dawson Bates, the Minister for the Economy, the actual name slips my mind there, but they did very little to combat this. And what that did, or the social effect was that it enabled the further division of Catholics and Protestants. We could also look at the idea of social welfare. So Great Depression makes more people reliant on social welfare payments, as obviously unemployment skyrocketed during that period. So 36% of the population in the mid-30s now living below the poverty line. That's an extremely scary statistic to deal with, that nearly half of the population was living below the poverty line in Northern Ireland. So unemployed received 12 shillings a week, which was well below the cost of living in Belfast. And by 1935, this idea of outdoor relief was brought in, which was a strict means test introduced that determined the need for social welfare for people. It led to handouts of food stamps for people in Northern Ireland as well. So paragraph 4, social effects of World War II. So we're dealing with the impact of wartime related industries. So we see the creation, World War II kicks off, it creates jobs in industrial industries, shipbuilding and linen. So the two industries that were hit hardest during that Great Depression get, I suppose, a huge boost in terms of economic boost. But this was essentially boosted as workers were needed to maintain army and air force bases. So we see unemployment fall from 30% in mid-1930s to 5% in 1943. So a huge drop in unemployment. Unemployment is essentially eradicated over those years. Wages rise by 15%, which was closer to average British wages. So not only were people working now, they were being paid more for their work. That increased the disposable income available to people. It improved the quality of life. They had more money to spend. Promise of jobs draws workers from south, and it introduced a system of work permits that limited for a limited time. That people that were moving from the Free State to the north could only stay in Northern Ireland for a small period of time. We could also look at army recruitment and how that affected the people there. So the 1939 Military Training Act, it stopped conscription extending to Northern Ireland. However, we see the Northern Ireland government have this huge kind of recruitment campaign. It calls on people to join the British war effort. However, it was a poor turnout. Only 2,000 per month in 1939, drops to 1,000 per month by 1940. In total, 19,000 people, Northern Irish people, joined the British forces. Basil Brooks was appointed to organise recruitment in Northern Ireland. He was known for his sectarian discrimination. It was evident through his handling of the economic crisis and how he did little to support nationalists or even Catholics in terms of having access to work. The Ulster Protestant League, obviously looking for safeguarding the employment for Protestants. He did nothing to stop this. He insists that the B Specials form a core of new Northern Irish Army force, and he kind of feared that the nationalists would receive training through military, so he did nothing to support the nationalists in terms of army recruitment or joining the British Army effort either. So the economic effects of World War II on the country. So we outline wartime industrial production. So there was an initial slow start to the increase of industrial output. We looked at how new British industries established in Northern Ireland to put important industry out of the reach of German Air Force. So the British government thought, okay, we'll set up these wartime industries in Northern Ireland because the German Air Force won't bomb Northern Ireland. That would obviously not be true. So we see 140 warships produced, which included 6 aircraft carriers and up to 120 trading ships. Harland and Wolff adopts and begins constructions of tanks and aircrafts. We could look at Shorts aircraft firms. They built 1,200 bomber planes that would be used over the course of World War II. And the linen industry revived after a campaign to switch agricultural focus to flax. We could also look at agricultural production, so important food source for the UK as rationing was introduced over this period. By the end of the war, 800,000 acres of tillage farming and a number of cattle rises to 1 million in the Northern Ireland agricultural economy. And it benefited from grants and subsidies from the UK at this point. So now we have our case study. So we have the Blitz 7th of 8. Remember, we don't deal with the Blitz in one paragraph by itself. We split the 3 separate bombing events into 3 separate paragraphs. So the Blitz 7th of 8th of April. So we provide background information. Up to this point, the Luftwaffe had devastated British cities in the Blitz tactic, but had not bombed Northern Ireland. And what this did was encourage complacency. So people believed essentially that Northern Ireland wouldn't be bombed over that period. And over 20 false alarm alerts went over Belfast in 1940 to 1941 alone. To think about the effect that had on people, 20 false alarms over that 1 year period. So people started to take that for granted. Think about a fire alarm going off 40 times in 1 year in your school. It starts to become kind of a story of the boy who cried wolf, and you're like, there's not really a fire. So people became complacent over that. So first bombing on the night of the 7th and 8th of April. So 7 German bombers targeted the Dockland area of the city. 13 people killed, 100 people injured, 17 fires break out as a result. The Docklands were damaged, but not too badly. The air raid sirens only go off after the attack ended. So think about, I suppose, the complacency in the Northern Irish economy at this time, that the air raid sirens didn't even go off in the middle of the attack. The aftermath, government newspaper reports tried to play down the damage and risk to Northern Ireland. This was a mistake on the government's part, as only 3,000 people respond to the evacuation and very little volunteers sign up to repair the damage. So we see mistakes on the government's part here, the complacency in the leading up to the bombing, and then trying to report or play down the reports on the damage would lead to more damage in the next couple of events. So a week later, smoke screens installed were background info first. Smoke screens were installed in the harbour to provide cover for future attacks. Tuesday 15th of April, clear evening, at 10:40 air raid sirens start ringing. This was not a false alarm. 90 German bombers fly too high for anti-aircraft guns to take down. They drop flares on the city which are intended to counteract the smoke screens. 700 high explosive bombs, 29,000 incendiaries and 26 parachute mines dropped on the city. 900 people die, 100,000 people forced to evacuate, become homeless. This was devastating. Aftermath, anger towards the government as the lack of preparation is revealed. We see 6,000 refugees flee to Dublin from Belfast at this point. And these 29,000 incendiaries, these are bombs that essentially start fire. So Belfast was up in flames after this. There was huge damage. We can see 900 people dying in that one attack alone. Huge, devastating attack. Then we have the 5th of May. So Luftwaffe's last major attack on Belfast. Very clear and visible night once again. Luftwaffe dropped nearly 100,000 incendiary bombs, the ones that essentially start fires in the city, and 250 tons of high explosive. Most of these hit the intended targets of the industrial Dockland area. 2/3 of Harland and Wolff were destroyed 6 months before production could start again. There was less deaths this time because they targeted industrial areas such as the shipbuilding industries at the Belfast Docklands. However, you can reflect on the Blitz as a whole at this point. So 53% of homes in Belfast were affected by this bombing. 100,000 people made homeless. Highest damages bill submitted to the United Kingdom out of any other city except London. So Belfast was destroyed during those 3 bombing events of the Blitz. Then finally we write our conclusion. So we essentially assess how the North was impacted through both crises. We talk about, do you think the war was good or bad for them in the long run? Think about the idea of strengthening the union with Britain and how that maybe solidified partition. Also, you could highlight how the Irish Free State's neutrality helped this, how this would lead into the future in Northern Ireland. So we see the introduction of the welfare state, which was implemented through our British policies. We could argue it was bad for them. It increased sectarian division in employment. Nationalists outlawed in Northern Ireland now, essentially tarnished with the brush of Free State's neutrality in the war from the British perspective, obviously. Before we finish up for the day, folks, let's look at how I write a paragraph here, okay? So what I just wanted to highlight to you guys, obviously I covered huge amounts of detail there in our micro essay plan. You don't use all of the detail for each paragraph. We focus on 1 or 2 pieces of information and we write and focus on them well. So let's look at paragraph 5 here, the economic effects of World War II on Britain. So what I want you to highlight, or we'll actually flick to the net. Oh, we'll read it from here and then we'll go through it in detail. No, we'll read it from here. Sorry, guys. So we're going to read through it here. We're going to highlight characteristics of good historical writing as we go through. And please notice how I use my Peel paragraph approach to constructing this paragraph. So the sources from this period of history suggest that World War II had huge economic impacts for the economy of Ireland. First thing I do is I react to the question. The essay question was asking us to talk about the impact of the world economic crisis or World War II on Northern Ireland. So I need to say that it had huge impacts. Next thing that I need to do is state my main argument. So firstly, there was an initial slow start to the increase of industrial output in Northern Ireland as Hitler blocked imports of flax seeds in the economy. However, this would change when new British industries were established in Northern Ireland to put important industry out of reach from the German Air Force. So I state my main argument that we're going to see British industries, wartime industries placed in Northern Ireland to put them out of the reach of the German Air Force. Now we need to provide historically correct references to back up our statement. So let's go through them. Or what I'm going to do here is first is show evidence of outside reading, watching or listening. So I've included a quote here from Lord Craigavon at the time, and Northern Irish Prime Minister. So, as Prime Minister of Northern Ireland, Lord Craigavon declared on the day after Britain announced it was at war with Germany, the whole of the resources of the province would be placed at the disposal of the Imperial Parliament. So we can see evidence of outside reading straight away. Now I need to provide factual evidence. So as a result of the trust placed on Northern Ireland by the British, the Northern Ireland industrial sector began to thrive, producing 140 warships, which included 6 aircraft carriers and up to 120 trading ships. Furthermore, Harland and Wolff adopts and begins construction of tanks and aircraft parts on top of ships, while Short's aircraft firm builds 1,200 bomber planes. So I provide factual evidence. Now I need to explain that evidence. Consequently, the increased industrial output resulted in full male employment by 1940. So male employment was at 0% by 1944. So I explained that evidence. Now I've got my evidence of outside reading, viewing or listening, and now I need to link that back in at the last sentence. We can therefore see that World War II had a positive impact on industrial output in the Northern Ireland economy, as most industrial companies made a switch to producing wartime goods, which would eradicate unemployment in Northern Ireland. And what the last thing you'll notice throughout this paragraph, I've included my connective words or linking words. Firstly, however, consequently, therefore, all included throughout that paragraph. Okay guys, that's us. Before we finish up, I'll just say use the code HISTORY20 to get 20% off standard and premium plans on ExamRevision's website. And thanks for tuning in today, folks. So I'll see you soon.